Hello and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be talking on a user requested video, which is forms and how to deal with forms, which is not a very interesting, fun topic to talk about because it's very, very complex. But today I'm going to go through the basics of how to do it for those who need to do it, because I think every TV app out there requires some kind of input from the user. And so I've set up a demo app with a very basic input form. But what I first recommend is, if you can avoid forms and keyboard entering or entering from the user at all, like you want to avoid keyboards as much as possible. So ideally, you would use some kind of QR code that they could then use their phone to log in, or text to speech. So if they can do voice search, voice navigation, like that's ideally better than keyboard entering. Because for me, even as a user, if I'm using a remote and I have to enter my email address and I'm navigating all over the place, like it is a lot of work. So first thing I would recommend is, if you can avoid forms at all, avoid forms. But if you can't, this is how you would do it. So first thing I'm going to go over is the input box, because I think the input box is kind of the simplest, which is all this is a node with a rounded border, and then there's a text input inside. And we're just changing the value of text as a user clicks on the keyboard. So I will switch over to VS Code and we can look at what an input looks like. And again, this is all now open source on the Solid demo app, so you can actually just go and check out this source code yourself. You're welcome to grab these components. The reason these are not primitives on Solid is because I have multiple clients and everyone has a different looking keyboard. None of them are the same. They're the same functionality, but they all look completely different. So we kind of copy paste the keyboards from other projects, but then we tweak them. We tweak them because they all want a different layout or a different format or something, and it's just very hard to make a generic component that everybody actually likes and use. So spend the day, copy this code, put a keyboard in your thing, and just utilize the same thing. So when we look at input, here is our input component. And there's a lot of complexity in here dealing with the input strings. So if it's a backspace or delete, like we're passing it in as a string, and then rather than putting delete in the string in the input, it deletes the previous value. So it slices, it does all of that magic work. This really makes you appreciate the HTML inputs and the work that's behind them. But there's a lot of code that has to be written to make these things happen. But as far as the UI, it's very simple. We have one outer view, which does the border around it. And then there's one text component that just always has its text value just being replaced as new input comes in. So let's talk now about the keyboard. And the keyboard is, again, very similar. So we put in a format for the keyboard. And this is because this is our keyboard object that represents the keyboard. And it's a whole bunch of different rows. So we have a row of the 1 through 0. Then we have the QWERTY keyboard here. But for each of the different formats, because you want uppercase, you want lowercase, you might want ABC format versus QWERTY format, the list goes on. What we're doing is we're just representing it as data and then passing it into our keyboard to then print out those items. And again, the keyboard is very simple for the UI perspective. You have one column, so that gives you your up and down. And then you're just printing out rows of individual keys. So that's essentially it, rows of individual keys. So here's our keyboard, and now I can press up and down with our column, and we're going left and right inside of one individual row. And so the tricky part, or the question now becomes, well, if I hit enter here, how is it taking this value and putting it up into the input box? And there's two ways of doing this. So I'm going to go through the one way that I just thought of before I was recording this video, is there's new functionality added to Solid, which is emit. And emit basically says, I want to emit an event. So I can, inside of here, inside of my keyboard, my onEnter handler, I can just say keyboard.emit character, and then pass up or bubble up whatever the value of the keyboard or the key is that they pressed. And then inside of your component, you now have an on character. So this is the event. You emitted a character event, and it's going to receive the value that you pass. So the first argument is the handler, which would be the keyboard. And then what are the arguments that it's passed? And then you get the character that way. So that's one way of solving this. That gives you the character that was entered on the keyboard, and then all you have to do next is then pass that value into input. But that requires, again, passing. So what we do is we just create a signal. Signals probably are the best way of doing this. And so I'm going to go back to just showing off the signal. So on my parent components, which is the login page, I'm creating a signal, which is the value signal and the key event signal. So I actually have two signals here. And the keyboard, I pass in the signal, well, at least I pass in the on enter. So when enter is pressed, it's going to call an on enter callback, which then I can set the key event. So this was actually how I'm getting the value as I pass in an on enter handler, then I'm setting the key event here, and then this sets a signal, which is passed into the input. So the input has a key event, and the key event just represents what letter you pressed, or did you press enter, did you press backspace, any one of those, and then it processes the key event inside of input. So that triggers this function here, format input text. So whenever the key event triggers, it then calculates, well, what's my new value for to represent for the formatted text? And then it also updates this value signal so that when I do finally submit my form, I can get the value back from the input component. Hopefully that all makes sense. The other thing to note is I'm passing in signals as an array. So when you call create a signal, normally you destructure this, right? And you have a getter and setter, which then would be an array. So you would have value signal, set value signal. But if you don't destructure it, you basically have an array, which then you can pass both the getter and setter as a single item. And that way inside of here, then you would just break it apart from the array into two values, and then you have the getter and setter internally. And that's all that's happening with forms. Let me see if there's anything else I want to cover, but essentially this goes up and down. We see rows, we have an on enter, which is setting the values. And I think I made a change, so I have to reload the page, hot module reloading. So now when I make changes, I just press this, it's keeping track of where to place it, and I hit delete and it goes back, and all of these I can hit shift, and all that shift is doing is it's changing the format, which is then updating the keyboard. So you'll notice in this formats, there's a default, which is what we see by default. And then there is an uppercase. So the uppercase, when I hit shift, it changes to this uppercase, which then goes through, loops through and updates all the text values to these other values. All right, as always, feel free to like, comment. If you want an additional video or details about how to do this, please let me know. This code is available in the Solid Demo app. There's a new login page, which goes through the input and keyboard components. So if you go to examples and go to login and forms, that's how you can find this code. All right, thank you and take care. Let me know again for other ideas.